Thank you. Thank you.
Now that's a new tradition. She only gets to have a speech.
Now, before I begin, I want to cue up my slideshow. I want to thank a number of people that are involved. First of all, the Provost, because I do think that this is an important tradition to have for our college. I also want to thank the selection committee for inviting me to present this research. It means a lot to me to have a forum where I can discuss this. And especially my colleagues in the Department of History and Philosophy and in African American Studies, who have just been outstanding in their support and encouragement, making me feel welcome in my new home. There are a number of things that the presentation itself will not address, so I'm going to hold some of these issues for the Q&A. For instance, I'm not going to, at least at the beginning, talk about how I got into the project, but I will. And really, the other person I need to thank is Carol Jean Dokes, because she's the woman that made this possible. Please give her a round of applause. Carol Jean is the surviving daughter of Reverend Oaks, who I'm going to talk about today, and if it were not for her diligence in bringing this information to light to a librarian at Rutgers, it wouldn't have gotten to me at the University of Tennessee, and then all the way around. So absolutely owe her a tremendous gratitude. In the Q&A, I want to talk about the photos. I'm going to just kind of loop them behind me as I'm doing the presentation, but definitely happy to answer any questions and talk about those in the Q&A, and then historical controversies or issues that I hope to address in the book that may not show up in the presentation itself. So I'll begin with the presentation. I'll talk for about 35, 40 minutes. Hope you guys don't fall asleep. And then we'll start the Q&A. The Lord has called us to a hard task. The balmy waters of the Pacific Ocean embraced the lean black bodies of the men of the 503rd Anti-Aircraft Battalion. The solemn march into the sea for the purposes of a mass baptism. The solemn march into the sea for the purposes of a mass baptism signaled both advance and retreat. At the head of the baptismal procession was Reverend Robert Dokes. When Reverend Dokes raised his hand above his head at this azure crossroads, he invoked a higher power to give his men strength for the fight. Because these men had to fight on two fronts, this invocation was more than a prayer for salvation. It represented preparation for a battle against quick death in front and slow death behind. This presentation examines the lives of African American soldiers during World War II through the eyes of one of their own. Reverend Dokes served with thousands of black soldiers in different regiments and battalions in the roughly 5 years of his enlistment in the United States Army. The bulk of these men were soldiers assigned to non-combat units. This talk will open with a brief examination of the early life and education of Reverend Dokes, then move into a discussion of his mandatory periodic reports, as well as the letters which he wrote home from 1942 to 1945. This analysis of both documentary and oral history sources is informed by traditional scholarship in the fields of military history and African American history, as well as cutting-edge approaches in African American studies like critical race theory. As such, this presentation seeks to be more than simply a laundry list of activities, trials, and tribulations. Through this combination of disciplines, this presentation hopes to illuminate the multiple meanings of black military service and the gifts that blacks have repeatedly rendered to America. The gift metaphor comes from W.E.B. Du Bois's book entitled The Gift of Black Folk. Du Bois's 1924 text and its ideas have been refreshed by scholars like Cornel West and Phil Zuckerman. Whereas West discusses the African American gift to American democracy, Zuckerman argues that Du Bois should be considered one of the country's most important religious sociologists. Drawing upon Du Bois's perspective on democracy and religion, this article argues that Reverend Dokes was an exemplar of the quest for social justice through military service and engaged citizenship. Moreover, these sources demonstrate that Reverend Dokes and his men developed an alternative Christian practice as a result of white supremacy. In addition, these men, denied access to the war's battlefields, performed masculinity in a unique way aimed at preserving their sense of manhood as the Army sought to extinguish it. Finally, within the confluence of alternative Christian practice and masculine performance, Reverend Dokes and his men conceived of a subversive form of citizenship practice that rejected mainstream American citizenship. At base, Reverend Dokes' writings reveal the tremendous gift that he and his men provided America in the exigency of war, a gift that West might call the Socratic inquiry that breathed life into democracy. So perhaps we should begin by answering a simple question. Who was this man, Dokes? Pre-war life. Let me see if I can get this to... Sorry. Born in Noblesville, Indiana, on December 22, 1904, Robert Boston Dokes came of age during one of the most brutally violent periods in the African American experience. However, the childhood memories he recounted for his daughter only suggested a life of simple pleasures and typical boyhood pursuits. Carol Jean Dokes, daughter of Reverend Dokes, indicated that her father was shielded from much of the violence and bigotry of the era by his grandfather, the Reverend Barney Stone, an extraordinary man in his own right. Reverend Stone was born into slavery on May 17, 1847, in Spencer County, Kentucky. His owners savaged the slaves on the plantation, and even as a boy, Barney Stone was whipped severely. Before young Barney reached the age of majority, his sister and mother were sold away from the plantation. At the outbreak of the American Civil War, and upon hearing that Union troops were nearing the area, Barney fled the plantation and hid in a culvert. Shortly thereafter, he was discovered by angry locals, possibly united as a slave patrol, and was about to be killed when Union soldiers arrived on the scene and scattered the hostile group. Barney Stone joined the Union Army and fought in several engagements, notably the Battle of Fort Wagner, over a period of nearly 21 months. He learned to read and write while serving in the military, and after the war, taught black children these important skills. In 1868, he became a minister, established 7 churches in Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and, quote, preached for the uplift and advancement of the colored race, end quote. According to Carol Jean, it was through Reverend Stone that the young Robert Dokes learned of the importance of education and living a committed life of service to others. As he left Indiana for higher education, Robert Dokes crossed the throngs of blacks who participated in the Great Migration by leaving the American South for the industrial centers of the North and Midwest. He attended West Virginia State University, then Howard University, both all-black institutions at the time. He ultimately received his BA in Divinity from Gordon College, a predominantly white school which then was located in Boston. Shortly thereafter, Reverend Dokes served as a pastor of the Lincoln Congregational Church in Brockton. It was during this period that Dokes maintained a courtship with Carol Cruz, a fellow Gordon student from Montclair, New Jersey. His letters to his future wife indicated his affection for her and presaged his determination to do his best work in spite of trying circumstances. Quote, "Dear Lamb, I miss you a great deal, and I wish you were here with me, which is an incentive to me to work hard so that we can be together as soon as possible. I have just returned from the first prayer church meeting of the Lincoln Congregational Church, and you must believe me when I say it was some meeting. We had a very pleasant prayer service, but the business meeting was not up to standards, as they had a big fuss concerning the money matters between Mr. Artur and Mr. Torrance. Artur charged Torrance with not handling the money correctly, which resulted in a war of words and side-taking. I remained quiet, other than asking them to adopt Barton's Law of Congregational Usage as the official guide of the church. Brother Artur is a good businessman. However, he is quite rude in his methods, which is, if he is not careful, will antagonize his opponents. Mrs. Harris and the folks send love to you. To be truthful, dear, I don't know just how I will manage this situation. You must be in much prayer for me. I don't know how long we will be here if church meetings are as hot as the one tonight. The Lord has called us to a hard task, but I mean to get through. Yours, Bobby." He then moved to New York and received his master's in divinity from Union Biblical College, the precursor to Union Theological Seminary. After receiving his MA, Robert Dokes moved to New Jersey and began work as a teacher in Montclair. Reverend Dokes taught adult literacy classes under the auspices of the Works Progress Administration. Reverend Dokes was an associate minister in a small church in Patterson which rented space from a white landlord. According to two of the charter members of the Second Baptist Church in Patterson, Reverend Dokes split from the original church after he discovered that the landlord was overcharging the church. It was from this defiance that Reverend Dokes, Carol Cruz Dokes, and roughly 50 people, pictured here, many of whom are pictured here, established the Second Baptist Church of Patterson, New Jersey in late 1940. Unbeknownst to Dokes, another watershed moment in his life was soon upon him. Reverend Oaks volunteered to join the United States Army in May 1941. 3 months later, he began his career as a chaplain in Missouri at Fort Leonard Wood. Like all Army chaplains, Reverend Dokes filed monthly reports regarding the units with which he served. Dokes' initial chaplain's report indicated that the 92nd Engineers Battalion consisted of 31 commissioned officers and 1,122 enlisted men. Nearly 3/4 of the men identified as Protestant, 1% were Catholic, 1/2% were Jewish, and 1/4 indicated no denomination. The new chaplain's initial month of service with the 92nd was quite active and foreshadowed the remainder of his time in military service. Throughout August 1941, Reverend Dokes led 5 Sunday services with a cumulative attendance of 982 men. He dealt with 22 welfare cases. He took 8 hospital visits in which he met 212 soldiers and made 15 guardhouse visits to talk with 41 men. He conducted a memorial service for Private Lonnie Wright, whose body was sent home to Boughton, Arkansas, and held a special church service in the hospital with 36 in attendance. The new chaplain pointed out in his report that the base commanders had failed to provide facilities for his work, not even a tent or transportation for times when the unit performed exercises in the field. When Dokes took time from his investigation of the moral and recreational facilities available to the black soldiers at the fort, he met with local townspeople and participated in a handful of civilian events. Dokes maintained a robust pace of activity on and off the base through the balance of 1941. Dokes met with the Negro USO of Monroe, Louisiana, and spoke with 48 men from the 94th Engineers. Dokes' effort to investigate off-base moral and recreational facilities took him as far as Bishop College, a historically black college then located in Marshall, Texas. In addition to the usual Sunday services, Reverend Dokes spoke at the Mansfield Music Festival, met with 8 local ministers, and preached 3 services at nearby churches. He even accompanied his men to a performance of the Barnum Bailey Circus in Shreveport, Louisiana. Attendance at Sunday services and Bible study gatherings remained high during November and December of 1941. Eventually, Chaplain Dokes got his own office with a telephone and a field organ for use during religious gatherings. When the men of the 92nd Engineers formed their own choir, Dokes attended all of the rehearsals. In addition to the various visits with soldiers, the chaplain had a high number of consultations, 254 requests for counsel and advice with 263 men. Dokes also supervised 4 literacy courses. The chaplain gave 2 sex lectures in December with a cumulative attendance of 1,664, another measure perhaps of his popularity with the men. In addition, Dokes joined or taught classes at the 6th Division School for Chaplains. The lack of facilities available to him and his men consistently frustrated Chaplain Dokes. The inability or unwillingness of commanding officers at Fort Leonard Wood to provide for Dokes' Christian work likely exemplified their dim view of black soldiers. Dokes displayed his savvy by offering no harsh words for the officers in his monthly reports, preferring simply to say that, quote, Major Whitehead, our commanding officer, is doing all he can to keep the battalion from having any serious racial conflict, end quote. Yet problems persisted, and the other parts of his report reflected that fact. Although the base commanders finally allowed the black soldiers to use one of the new chapels at an off-base encampment, Dokes found that at Camp Robinson, quote, the permanent equipment belonging to the chapel had been removed before the black soldiers arrived. Matters came to a head in February. Dokes touched upon the subject of a transfer in a letter he wrote to the chief of chaplains shortly after submitting his January 1942 report. I am now serving under my 4th commanding officer since I have been with the battalion. The first 3 gave me good cooperation, and I was able to stand even in the midst of difficulties. At the close of the Louisiana maneuvers, my present commanding officer was instrumental in having me returned to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri 3 weeks before the battalion to appease certain white Southerners. who objected to my eating with the white officers at the officers' mess table. At the time, he expressed to me his opinions of Negroes in general and what he thought of our being officers in the Army of the United States. Now we are again in the South. I do not eat with the other white officers because it would be a source of confusion. I have no ill feeling against my commanding officer. However, I do not feel that he will give me protection or consideration as long as we are in the South. I am writing you for advice in this trying situation. If you feel that it is safe to go on, I will continue. I shall be guided by whatever advice you may give me. The official response to Dokes was benign and urged patience. We appreciate the problem expressed in your communication and hope that it will be possible for you to continue to minister effectively to the men of your unit. We have noted your case, and if and when it becomes possible to give you consideration for a transfer, we shall try to do so. Until such time as this is possible, it is our hope that you shall be able to meet all situations in the spirit of him in whose name we minister as chaplains in the Army of the United States. In just over a week, Dokes was transferred to Fort Lewis, Washington, and began serving with the 243rd Quartermaster Battalion. Reverend Dokes transferred to Fort Lewis in March 1942 after a farewell party and a final sermon at Little Rock's First Baptist Church, where he preached before more than 500 people. The 243rd that he joined was a bit smaller than the 92nd Engineers, with only 20 commissioned officers and 863 enlisted men. He likely was surprised to find immediate provision of many of the facilities which he did not have in Fort Leonard Wood, a chapel with office equipment and one corporal as an assistant. In his closing remarks at the end of the month, he wrote, quote, "The commanding officer shows an unusual interest in the spiritual welfare of his men. The response of the enlisted men to the religious services is very gratifying," end quote. During his first full month at Fort Lewis, Reverend Dokes noted that 984 soldiers attended regular Sunday services. Another 402 came to evening services, and 184 attended Bible study classes. He started a small choir and received more than 100 men looking for counsel and advice. The young chaplain also gave 2 sex morality lectures with a combined attendance of 428 men and separate orientation lectures to the men of the 46th and 62nd Quartermaster Regiments. Even when the strength of the 243rd sagged a bit, Reverend Dokes remained as busy and as popular as ever. Attendance at religious services actually increased despite the loss of men. In addition to the numerous requests for counsel and advice, as well as the hospital and guardhouse visits, Dokes intervened in a handful of disciplinary cases. Dokes also made arrangements for a Catholic Mass in the area, presided over a wedding, and conducted his first baptism in the military, in addition to his activities off base. Dokes was convinced that the unrelenting pace of his work resulted from the fact that he was the only black chaplain in that region of the nation. Reverend Dokes' hard work earned him the respect and admiration of his commanding officer and other military superiors. Chaplain Bradley wrote to Washington, D.C., praising Dokes and recommending that he serve with an entire division of black soldiers. We have here in the 243rd the best Negro chaplain I have ever met, Chaplain Robert B. Dokes. He has heard that a new Negro division, the 92nd, is to be organized, and he wants to get into it. Chaplain Dokes is a fine, intelligent, level-headed chaplain. He has won the respect of everyone with whom he has come into contact, both officers and men and civilians. Whenever there's been an incipient clash of the races, Chaplain Dokes has been sent for, and he has straightened things out. In fact, just now he is down at Camp White and Camp Adair working on that very thing. He is a tireless worker. If he could be sent to the chaplain school to give him more military knowledge, he would make a good assistant division chaplain. I do not believe that he has had enough military experience to be a division chaplain, and that is the only reason I would not recommend him for that position. Anything you can do for him will be appreciated. In turn, Dokes went outside the normal bureaucratic record keeping to praise the base leadership. It would be difficult to find anywhere finer cooperation than that which we received at Fort Lewis, Washington. Our commanding officer there was a man who understood our problems as well as a man of excellent Christian character. Despite his indefatigable efforts and the support of superior officers, Reverend Dokes could not shield completely his men from the torments of racial fascism. In the same letter in which he praised the Fort Lewis officers, Dokes reported on the difficulties that black soldiers encountered in the area. Before we left Fort Lewis, Washington, complete facilities for recreation had been established, not only on the post, but in Seattle and in Tacoma, also for our men. Here at Camp Adair, we have encountered an almost opposite situation. We appreciate the fact that the camp is not completed and will not be for some time to come. Despite hardships, our men have already earned a good report for their behavior so far at this camp. Trouble has arisen because passes were forbidden to neighboring cities, and our men are allowed to go only to Portland, Oregon, 85 miles away on Saturday evenings. The MPs in neighboring cities were ordered to arrest any of our soldiers found there unless they were accompanied by an officer. As a result, Negro truck drivers were arrested and humiliated by MPs in the city of Albany, Oregon, while on official business. The morale of the men has been considerably lowered. The source of most of our trouble, as I see it, arises because practices acceptable in one part of our nation are being insisted upon in another part. Our difficulty has arisen because we cannot, in mind or spirit, agree that these practices are necessary. Within 2 weeks, Dokes received a reply from the Office of the Chief of Chaplains that again suggested patience and discretion, and informed him that a transfer to the 92nd Division was not forthcoming because its complement of chaplains had been filled. In essence, Dokes and his men had to handle these circumstances and on their own find a solution to their problem. Even with supportive commanding officers, Dokes worked a relentless pace as a result of racial segregation and the dearth of black military leadership. Over the course of 1942, he averaged preaching 14 services a month with a cumulative attendance of over 1,100 men. While moving back and forth between Fort Lewis and encampments like Camp Robinson and Camp Murray, Chaplain Dokes served the men of 2 companies to which he had not been assigned and attended sessions at the 9th Army Chaplain School. When he was off base, Dokes led a prayer meeting at Tacoma's First Baptist Church, attended the annual meeting of the Colored YMCA, and led the battalion's popular spiritual choir and quartet to multiple performances throughout the Seattle-Tacoma metropolitan area, on stage and on radio station KVI. All of these appearances drew large crowds. As a reward for his tireless work, Dokes received a 2-week leave of absence that stretched into the middle of October. When Chaplain Dokes returned from his leave of absence, the 243rd shipped out to Hawaii. The move from Washington State temporarily reduced Dokes' interaction with civilian communities. Nevertheless, he continued to serve soldiers other than those to whom he was assigned. In his November report, he wrote that services for Catholic and Jewish personnel were provided for at Post Chapel. By permission of the battalion commander, I voluntarily offered to conduct these services and services for the troops of my group stationed near here. One service was held for the 369th. Our men are separated extensively. Services were not held on Sunday, November 1, 1942, as our men were busy on a special detail. Dokes did not shy away from indicating what he and his men confronted, nor did he in turn fail to communicate words of praise to his superior officers near year's end. Yet, upon reaching Hawaii, Dokes communicated his frustrations regarding the ubiquitous limitations placed on black soldiers because of racial segregation. The unwillingness of the Army to put serious effort into the, quote, recreation problem, end quote, for black troops left the men with few options other than gambling and excessive drinking. My dear wife, as I write this letter, I'm quite a ways from camp. We had a good service and a good attendance, but my problems become heavier and heavier as the boys tire of this place and problems arise. No serious consideration has been given to the recreation problem of our men, and I fear we are headed for trouble before anything is done. Love, Dokes. The year ushered in an unprecedented pace of action for Chaplain Dokes. During the first quarter of 1943, the young minister performed an average of 24 religious services each month, with a cumulative attendance of 6,000 servicemen and civilians, no doubt because of his willingness to go beyond his literal assignment. As he put it in January 1943, quote, 3 units other than my own were served during the month. Communion services were held with each unit served, end quote. He had numerous meetings with the post chaplain and non-commissioned officers from various units, in addition to the more than 500 requests by soldiers for counsel and advice. Chaplain Dokes even ran geography and current events classes. Dokes supplemented his hospital and guardhouse visits with presentations before an interfaith group and a high school assembly and a lecture during Race Relations Sunday at a local Chinese Christian church. Dokes sought help from his commanding officers in Hawaii as well as in the nation's capital, but to no avail. One can only guess that Dokes' usual practice of serving more men than he should have and doing the work of other chaplains slowly was transforming from being conventional to excruciating. In turn, Dokes' men were struggling with their social confinement and lack of recreational options. The resulting boredom among black soldiers led to lowered morale and a mental strain which placed a number of black troops under medical care and observation. My dear wife, I'm visiting one of our companies today apart from the main camp. 2 of our men are under observation in the mental ward. Several of our men have broken down mentally under the strain since we have been here. Keeping busy is one of the best ways to avoid a mental strain while on foreign duty. The morale of our boys is not very good, and few of them seem to realize what we are here for. Those who are most emotionally religious seem to be the first to break. I'm trying to help them get a balanced view of their situation. I am well and busy. The toll of breakdowns was a consistent refrain in Chaplain Dokes' letters home. Accordingly, Dokes monitored race relations on his base, in surrounding communities, and throughout the military, as evidenced by the newspaper clippings which he kept, featuring headlines like, "Ferry pilots must be white, says Brit," or "Trinidad leader fears riot with white U.S. troops." Apparently, the minister made a point to distribute his reading materials to other black soldiers. Even this seemingly small gesture was risky, as some bases banned black-owned publications. Chaplain Dokes attributed these problems largely to racism within the military, which he felt took racial segregation with it, no matter where it traveled. The tensions between white and black soldiers were such that Dokes remarked on the importance of sympathetic officers, writing to Carol Cruz Dokes that I wouldn't remain here of my own free will for a day if Colonel Harris wasn't our commanding officer. On May 2nd, 1943, the military assigned Chaplain Dokes to the 369th Regiment, the famed Harlem Hellfighters. For many black soldiers, this was an appreciable promotion, moving from a service unit to a combat unit. The transfer had the immediate impact of lowering the number of services for the month to 8, with only 1 in the evening. As usual, the longer Chaplain Dokes stayed with the unit, the greater interaction he had with the men. The number of official religious services increased from 8 in May to 11 in June and 12 in July, and attendance rose correspondingly. Unlike his previous stint with the 243rd in Hawaii, Dokes participated in few, if any, joint or civilian services during the heat of the summer. In addition, he received a temporary promotion on July 10th from first lieutenant to captain. August brought important visitors to Chaplain Dokes and his men. We are watching as the passengers stepped out of the big Clipper plane. After a moment or two, we saw Bishop Gregg, with grace and dignity, step out of the plane, followed by his aide, Chaplain J.A. DeVoe of the 93rd Division. Although the chaplain's report never fully mentions or fully names this man, the visitor most likely was Bishop John Andrew Gregg of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who visited numerous war fronts at the invitation of President Franklin Roosevelt. Captain Dokes chronicled Bishop Gregg's visit from his arrival on August 8th until his departure about a week later. On Monday, August 9th, Bishop Gregg and Chaplain DeVoe visited the regimental headquarters of the 369th and met with white officers of varying ranks. The 2 generals with whom they met expressed their appreciation of the visit and requested Bishop Gregg to make a personal report of his findings and any recommendations he thought would be helpful. Dokes' report provides no detail regarding the meetings, but offers a glimpse into the interactions between his soldiers and Bishop Gregg. The band of the 369th gave a brief concert in honor of Bishop Gregg and Chaplain DeVoe. Bishop Gregg was especially pleased to be a guest of this all-Negro combat unit and told them of the heroic work and high praise that our soldiers had earned in the Southwest Pacific area. Bishop Gregg and his party returned to the 369th and visited a battery in field position. To the delight of the men, Bishop Gregg, in his dignified, fatherly manner, again brought words of inspiration and greeting from the churches and the home folks. A sergeant, a college graduate, later came to the regimental chaplain and told him of his desire to enter the ministry. The day with the 369th was concluded by a brief visit and a talk with the officers and the men of the 2nd Battalion. On Thursday, August 12th, Bishop Gregg and Chaplain DeVoe spent time with the Service Chaplains Association of Hawaii and in the afternoon spoke to black sailors. Later that evening, the two men were guests at an after-dinner gathering with Admiral Nimitz and other high-ranking naval officers. Captain Dokes traveled with the visiting ministers when they journeyed to the outlying islands of the archipelago and enjoyed less formal activity, a baseball game played between different black regiments. Following the game, Captain Dokes and the others convened an evening worship service as an appropriate climax to Bishop Gregg's trip. In the concluding remarks of his August 1943 monthly report, Captain Dokes wrote that, quote, "The visit of Bishop J.A. Gregg did much for the morale of the men, end quote. Although Chaplain Dokes eagerly anticipated Bishop Gregg's arrival and was pleased that the minister visited the base, he worried that Gregg's report would be unnecessarily glowing. Despite the fact that Bishop Gregg and his assistant spent some time with Dokes, they talked to rather than with the enlisted men, the black enlisted men, and thus Dokes worried that their report would create an inaccurate impression of the stresses faced by his men for the president and others in his cabinet. My dear wife, I've been busy all day entertaining Bishop Gregg and Chaplain DeVoe. We were happy to have them visit us. However, such trips reveal little of the actual conditions existing among our Negro soldiers. No doubt the bishop will report that all is well because he has been entertained royally. He spoke very well, but I am disappointed in that he was not able to actually talk with our soldiers and get their point of view. The balance of 1943 and the beginning of 1944 witnessed another increase in Captain Dokes' workload. For example, in November, he performed 15 morning church services for 726 men and 5 evening services for another 845 people. The crush of bodies likely was all the more remarkable because services were usually held in mess shacks. In addition to the misery of racial subordination, Chaplain Dokes indicated to his wife that he constantly grappled with a grueling schedule and bouts of homesickness. In addition to the usual guardhouse and hospital visits, Captain Dokes was assigned hospital duty for a limited time in October 1943. Nevertheless, he managed to deliver his sex morality lectures, distribute copies of the New Testament, and preside over a number of weddings. As the 369th was reorganized and redesignated the 369th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group, the military added to Dokes' responsibilities, forcing him to serve 2 other Negro battalions in separate anti-aircraft groups. If he had not learned by the winter of 1943, surely this convinced Dokes that some things never changed. He often complained to his wife about this exhausting pace and desperately hoped for more black chaplains. By comparison to Dokes' pace, the published recollections of a white chaplain indicate that he generally preached a single Sunday service and had time to engage in creative activities to raise the morale of homesick white troops. At least one other World War II chaplain, Chaplain Victor Lakatek, whose diary recently was made public, complained of boredom in his duties and the lack of religious interest among his men. Father Lakatek wrote, quote, "It is not so bad among the Catholics, but the Protestant minister rarely has more than 25 or 30 men at his service." Father Lakatek's writings reveal that he was convinced that religious practice deteriorated the longer the war went on. Dokes' experience was in many ways the converse. Because there was no army chapel, which the black soldiers could use, Chaplain Dokes held services outdoors or in mess halls. As a result, the soldiers built for him a pulpit and a wooden communion set. Again, Chaplain Dokes laid the blame at the feet of the army brass and a democratic society unable to escape the contradictions of its own racial fascism. My dear wife, a new USO has been opened here. However, I fear it is the beginning of Jim Crow as far as our men are concerned. As the American soldiers come, they also bring Jim Crow with them. I am wondering if after this war we will not have Jim Crow on a global scale. I am unable to picture the utopia we are supposed to have after this war is over. Without God, the Negro has little to look forward to. Unfortunately, the new year brought no respite for Captain Dokes and led him to a critical decision roughly a year after Bishop Gregg's visit. On June 16, 1944, Chaplain Dokes submitted a letter of resignation to his superior officers. In a simple missive, he wrote, 1, I herewith submit my resignation from the Chaplains Reserve Corps and request that I be relieved from active duty as soon as possible. 2, I accepted a commission in the Chaplains Reserve Corps on 7 June 1941 and entered on active duty on 31 July 1941. 3, as a conscientious Christian, I have been greatly disturbed by the discrimination practiced against Negroes in the U.S. Army. There appears to be no official response to the chaplain's resignation letter, yet at least one significant event took place in July 1944. Dokes' workload exploded. Dokes' July 1944 monthly report notes that he preached 27 Sunday services for over 1,000 troops and 9 weekday services for another 236. Again, Dokes indicated that the services were held in battery mess halls. As if to reinforce what the statistics clearly demonstrated, Dokes wrote in the remarks section of his report that services had been provided for the entire 7th Air Force Negro troops since he had been on duty in the island. The transportation crisis continued to the point that Dokes wrote in his August 1944 report that when he was released from duty with the 369th in order to serve the men of the 503rd, he was unable to perform the new task because there was no transportation to take him to his new assignment. Nevertheless, Dokes preached 35 services in the month of October 1944 with a cumulative attendance of 1,655 troops. Even with troop movements in December into the South Pacific, specifically aiming for Okinawa, Dokes held 21 preaching services. Attendance at the January 1945 services remained very high, and so too did the quality of Dokes' work. In the second week of the month, the commanding officer of the 503rd filed an efficiency report regarding Chaplain Dokes. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Calloway offered high praise for Dokes on various scaled questions. In the space for an adjectival rating, Calloway listed Dokes as excellent. In a brief statement regarding the chaplain, Calloway wrote that Dokes was a religious, comparatively well-educated chaplain who is eager and enthusiastic with his work and gets along well with the men whom he serves. During the first half of 1945, Chaplain Dokes held Bible classes and weekday services to offset the irregularity of Sunday services. Even when he had no facilities with which to work or the soldiers traveled at sea, he maintained an intimate rapport with his men. Once the 503rd reached the South Pacific War Theater, Dokes held open-air services. If the weather prohibited outdoor worship, then Dokes held smaller services in mess tents. He also continued to preach for other black units. As Dokes continued to minister to his men under enemy fire, his congregants in New Jersey attempted to get him back home. Dokes did not return to the mainland until the winter of 1945. His October 1945 report indicated that he had been assigned for movement to a reception station, but that he continued to hold preaching services in Okinawa. Dokes finally got close to home when he was hospitalized in Atlantic City 2 weeks before Christmas 1945 and reinstated to active duty. A separation extract indicates that Dokes was due 89 days of terminal leave and would continue in that capacity until March 27, 1946, when he would move to inactive status. Conclusion. Reverend Dokes' hard work earned him the respect and admiration of his commanding officers and of other military superiors. The lead chaplain at Fort Lewis wrote to Washington, D.C. in 1943 recommending Dokes for promotion. After the war reached its fiery climax in 1945, the commanding officer of the 503rd offered a special commendation to Dokes. Despite the effusive praise, it is unclear whether any of Dokes' commanding officers fully appreciated the chaplain's work. To begin, Dokes' ministry aimed to invigorate men who were fighting oppression by their fellow citizens while they fought alongside these same citizens against the common foe. The segregation practiced within the U.S. military was more than a simple effort to separate white from black. It acted as a negation of black humanity. Accordingly, Reverend Dokes and his men used religious practice to combat white privilege. Reverend Dokes sought to create an environment where he and other black men could practice their faith or be drawn deeper into it. They convened Sunday services in barracks, mess tents, or in open fields. When their chapels were sabotaged or when they were denied certain equipment, they made their own. Furthermore, they came in large numbers not only to listen to Reverend Dokes' sermons, but to fellowship with one another, to sing, to pray. One of the more striking things about Reverend Dokes' experience is just about everywhere he went, the response was the same. He encountered demoralized black soldiers, and the longer he remained with them, the more they attended religious services. Thus, Christianity was neither a chore nor a passive encounter with the supreme deity in the hopes of some future entitlement. For them, Christian practice was a means to grapple with hell on earth. Recall that when Dokes attempted to resign, he asserted that racism was blasphemous. In this respect, black religious practice became a survival tool and an aspect of an alternative masculine performance. Throughout American history, the ability to inflict pain, to control, to name, to kill have been the penultimate markers of masculinity. Clearly, one objective of occupational, residential, and educational segregation, along with lynching, forced removal, and an inhumane criminal justice system, was to emasculate black men as a means of protecting white privilege. Those black men who fought in elite units like the Tuskegee Airmen directly challenged this emasculation. However, the bulk of black soldiers had to find other ways to do so. The mental breakdowns that Reverend Dokes witnessed were likely caused by the cognitive dissonance within men trained to kill, yet forced to serve. For Reverend Dokes and his men, their unwillingness to surrender to white privilege reflected their recasting of masculinity. They were being men in the best way that they could by challenging the limits of agency both directly and indirectly. The men of the various units that Reverend Dokes served used their own initiative to serve their God and faith as they saw fit, rather than submit entirely to white supremacy. They tried to choose their battles carefully to prevent their annihilation. When Reverend Dokes wrote about black men being locked in military prisons in Missouri, fighting MPs in Washington State, or marrying Hawaiian women, he was describing various modes of confrontation with white masculinity. If one were to assign a cultural icon to define this type of masculinity, it would be Brer Rabbit rather than John Wayne. Reverend Dokes and his men resisted the limits of white supremacy rhetorically and physically. Black resistance meant fighting the limits of citizenship that germinated from a nation grown from a white settler colony. Given America's roots, citizenship was more than a simple legal or political category. Citizenship was and remains highly sexualized and racialized. Black men could believe that they were citizens based on the technical language of the Constitution or the blood sacrifice of their forebears in the nation's wars. Yet that belief would not protect them from the police, from vigilantes, or lynch mobs. And in war, the only outward proof of their Americanness came when German, Italian, or Japanese soldiers shot at them. Granted, their resistance was more reformist than revolutionary, and it did not always succeed, yet resist they did. Reverend Dokes expressed such resistance in his writings, in his repeated meetings with base commanders, and even in his letter of resignation. Dokes' letters and monthly reports resisted by chronicling the damage to black soldiers wrought by their own government. His efforts to seek better or more consistent transportation, equipment, or treatment of his men also reflected his rejection of a fatalistic acquiescence to white privilege. For his men, their willingness to come together to defend and encourage each other signaled another effort to challenge the limits of their place. The willingness of the men to sing redemption songs, to play a baseball game for a visiting dignitary, demonstrated a different type of citizenship. The ability of the men to create study clubs, their determination to seek advancement in rank, or their courage to confront exclusion with their brains and nerve, fists, or guns, were part of a reimagined activist citizenship. This model of citizenship challenged the very idea of America and questioned the discourse around a unique American heritage of freedom, meritocracy, and democracy. It did not assume that racial justice was inevitable. Moreover, at base, it inverted the mainstream notion of patriotism. The model of patriotism offered by Reverend Dokes and his men demonstrated that white people loved America because of what it gave them, while black people loved America in spite of what it took from them. In the final analysis, black resistance meant creating an alternative to both white citizenship and the shadow of citizenship that whites forced upon people of color. Theirs indeed was a hard task. Thank you. All right, any questions? I'll go. I was hoping that the slideshow would just run automatically, so I apologize. I'm not a tech whiz, so I was relying on my son to help me set this up. And he was more interested in playing Modern Warfare, so he didn't quite show me how to do this.
Well, first of all, we want to thank you because this was a highly stimulating and informative and thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
So thank you. I would like to ask, did the black soldiers from World War II have specific veterans organizations after the war? And do you see some of that organizing as perhaps a prelude to the civil rights movement?
Yeah, absolutely. There were units that organized after World War II. There were actually units that were organized before. The Buffalo Soldiers have been active for almost a century now. So they were organized long before World War II. Other black units did organize, and with the fraternal organizations, yes, many of them became kind of places, leadership training grounds for the civil rights movement. One of the historical controversies that my work tries to confront is the traditional scholarly approach to black soldiers is black soldiers had no political consciousness before war. Then they got into war, and then they were motivated to get active. And I'm saying, no, they had a political conscience when they went in. It just, you know, it just added more fuel to the fire once they came out. And so, yeah.
In some ways, like the military can help organize.
Right. Well, absolutely.
You see that parallel in Europe when black soldiers in colonies were recruited for the European army.
Right.
And then after the war, it was a focus for decolonization.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, George is, I have a cold. I'm very sorry.
That's okay.
George is a great colleague of mine. Actually, we work together to develop the African American Studies Center. I'm sure as a historian, you know, there is theoretical as well as methodological debate
Right.
regarding how to write history.
Mm-hmm.
It was an excellent narration, but how would you answer if somebody asks you regarding your narration, so what, George?
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
So what?
Right. And the so what, I think, would really kind of branch out into different areas. So in the immediate context of the war, the so what means, it challenges us to think very seriously about citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to give? What does it mean in the past for these soldiers who essentially were American primary in name only, and so had, you know, very little rights, even though they believed that they had them. So what does it mean for them to make this sacrifice, especially when there is no guarantee at the other end that their rights are going to be respected? But I also think that it carries forward into the present, and this is where it affects my teaching, because in talking about questions of citizenship, one of the things that I'm really struck by is this moment we're in, where this huge debate about immigration and who are citizens and who are not. And for me, one of the things that, again, that I'm motivated by is the fact that I see a number of students who either come from families who are first generation to the United States kind of settling for this notion or kind of accepting mainstream society defining them outside of citizenship. And I say, no, claim it, and find ways to claim it. And it can be whether you're claiming it by flying the American flag with, you know, whatever flag from your home country. It could be in all kinds of ways, but hold on to your culture while embracing this new identity and insist upon it. And that there are lots of ways to insist. I mean, voting is one, but there are lots of ways to insist. So for me, it has legs, the so what has legs even into the present.
Yeah, I think if you extend it to what you say now,
yeah,
it would be a great effect.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think this is also a fair question.
Mm-hmm.
So what? Because what happened shortly after 1945 and 46, the desegregation of the military,
Mm-hmm.
that had to come from the influence and the result, you know, the heroism that was shown both in the Pacific, you know, with the fighting and non-fighting units,
Right.
and in Europe,
Right.
you know, against Germans.
Right.
And you mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen, we had one of them here today.
Right.
I mean, without them, you might not have
Mm-hmm.
the desegregation of the military service.
Right,
And
right.
you might not have the progress and the legacy
Mm-hmm.
that we have today.
No,
So
absolutely.
I think that there has to be some follow-up,
Yeah.
you know, not just the political side,
Mhm.
but also within the military.
Right.
How
Right.
structurally the military changed
Mm-hmm.
from 1948 on.
Right, right. And this was it's a great point, because what you see in the Korean experience is in 1948, President Harry Truman, through executive order, desegregates the military. But the reality is the military remains very highly segregated. So you have black soldiers who are constantly pushing for this in various ways. So again, it's this you're absolutely right. This carries forward this notion of engaging and saying, well, what is a desegregated army? What does that look like? What does it mean for us as citizens to participate in it? So, yeah. Mark, did you have a question?
Yeah, there is a discourse about what the gentleman just said about
Mhm.
about the military being, you know, advancing in front of or ahead of, you know, the social norms of society.
Right.
This is a sort of a safe laboratory for resolving some issues of gender,
Right.
of race. You know,
Right.
I have a hard time reading that into your discussion.
Mhm.
You know, I
Mhm.
think as you talk about the notion of citizenship and how it's tied to certain heteronormative or masculine norms of, you know,
Right.
of warlike.
Right.
How can that translate into, you know, the civil rights movement when you've got, you know, you have two forms of you know, religious leaders, one
Mhm.
the Nation of Islam, the
Mhm.
other, you know, you could say the Southern Baptist,
Right.
you know, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they both trace their origins to, you know, non-military,
Mm-hmm.
you know, leadership and citizenship organization structures. How exactly does this fit in? Is it just a formation of oppositional consciousness?
Well,
that they discover their blackness while they're being in the front line or being segregated or being Jim Crow?
Well, part of it is organizational consciousness, but I also think of that part of it is an exercise, you know, in terms of, well, how do we get to where we want to go? Like you, I disagree with the general discourse that the military is necessarily this wonderful advancing ground for racial tolerance and diversity and all this other stuff. And that, to me, is one of these more recent narratives that kind of helps rationalize the fact we have an economic draft now. And black people, people of color, are overrepresented in the military. So I don't see it as a natural. And so for me, part of what I'm reading into this as well is that here's Dokes saying, okay, well, yeah, one option for your frustrations is to not do anything, is to not engage, is to withdraw. And some people will argue with withdrawal is itself a form of resistance. But Dokes' his argument is no, we have to press forward, we have to do whatever we can, whether it's singing in a choir. That's a form of resistance. Whether it's organizing meetings, you guys want to be, you know, officer candidates. Well, you got to bone up on your history or whatever it is you got to do. And so I think for him, the idea is this kind of engaged citizenship, that you get involved and you begin to kind of critique democracy, not simply accept powerlessness. In a way, and I didn't want to put this in here because I'm not quite clear how I think about it and how to articulate it, but it's almost similar to Nietzsche's notion. We were all eating, having lunch, and in the bottom photograph, you can see just under the flower base, my little tape recorder, voice-activated tape recorder. So I put it there under the flower base, you know, be non-intrusive and allow people to talk. But one of the stories that came out, I can't remember if it was Mrs. Middleton, but someone said, Reverend Oaks was the type of guy, he would put his hand in the fire for you. Whatever you needed to do, he would do it. He would be that type of person. And that he was very active in the NAACP in New Jersey in the 50s. And that the group of folks were organizing some march or protest in City Hall in Patterson. And they were very worried about him surviving because he was this outspoken. So I said, well, what did you do? She said, well, I did the only thing I could, honey. I put a hammer in my purse and I walked on down to City Hall. Anybody was going to attack him, I'm going to be there with my hammer. You know, I don't know what else I could do, but that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, no, he was definitely quite an outspoken individual. I saw some other hands. Yeah, Steve.
One thing I realized in listening to your lecture is that in order to be accepted as citizens, African American men had to do two completely contradictory things. To affirm their manhood, they had to kill, they had to fight and kill. But on the other hand, to be accepted at a human level, they had to be Christians or you know, or practice Christianity in some way. And how did the twain, you know, and it makes me think of when I was growing up, the two most prominent black men in America were Muhammad Ali and Martin Luther King. You talk about two poles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you actually raised two issues. One is this contradiction, which I also think, is very present for black soldiers, especially on the home front in the aftermath of wars like World War II, Korea, Vietnam. This is where you see a lot of the activists coming out, whether it's in the Black Panthers. Geronimo Pratt came out of Vietnam War. So these are men who go to fight and they say, well, if we can pick up guns and defend the flag 10,000 miles from home, certainly we can pick up guns and defend our communities right here. We should be able to do that. So yeah, there is this implicit contradiction for the soldiers generally. For Reverend Dokes, and one of the things I hope to kind of wrestle with, although the answer may be elusive, is this contradiction between faith and violence. And how do you wrestle with that, being a chaplain in this destructive capacity, in this destructive organization?
But so that's the thing, it's, you know, the African American men in those units, that's what they were, I mean, they were forced to wrestle with this unresolvable question.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes.
After Roosevelt's order to desegregate, how did integration, how was it implemented in the U.S. military?
It was very messy. There were a lot of problems.
Resistance?
Yeah, tremendous amount of resistance. Tremendous amount of resistance from white officers who thought it was a mistake. for blacks who felt as if the president kind of gave this order and then there's no support for it, so they're fighting uphill as well. There are a number of great memoirs from the Korean War era that kind of deal with that. One of my favorites is, oh man, I've forgotten the author, but the title is A Commie Never Called Me Nigger. And it's about a Korean War veteran who was writing about his own, his sense of contradiction and talking about going into the military and dealing with the segregation that he never faced growing up in Michigan. And now he's in the military serving the United States, and he's segregated in segregated units. Then they go fight. I've heard Charlie Rangel speak at the Congressional Black Caucus about his experience in Korea, where he said, I think it was the Battle of Incheon maybe, that was one of these disastrous battles for the U.S. military early on in the war, that the Koreans, supported by the Chinese, just completely overran the American lines. But because the white officers didn't want the black soldiers to fight, they had pushed the black soldiers to the back of the theater of operations. So the white soldiers are getting slaughtered. They come running back toward the base and say, hey, we gotta go, but y'all gotta go get the guns. And so the black soldiers now have to go back up to the front, retrieve the artillery, all the bullets, and they're just crazy. I mean, they're just angry. They're beyond anger. And then for some soldiers, like the guy who authored the book that I mentioned, he talks about at the end of the conflict, there being, or he thought at least in 1953, this sense of at least commonality with the black and white soldiers in the service. And then he said, as soon as we got back to the United States on the troop ship, it changed. It just went right back to the way it was. So it was very messy, very inconsistent. You had soldiers fighting soldiers, some soldiers, fragging or killing their officers. So yeah, it was a very, very messy situation. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I go? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks very much. I was wondering, was there any evidence or presence of alternative religion at that time, such as the Nation of Islam?
No, he never remarked about that. I never saw that in any of his reports.
In general, I'm just wondering at that time.
I don't recall from any of the books I read. I know the Nation was active at this particular time, but almost all of the World War II accounts that I've read or letters from soldiers, I don't ever remember seeing the Nation of Islam mentioned. That doesn't mean that it wasn't there, because it was certainly possible. And some scholars like Gerald Horne actually argue that the Nation was largely influenced by Japan, Japanese success in the Russo-Japanese War and in the First World War. And so they kind of saw Japan as this model for, Asiatic manhood. So it's possible, but I just haven't seen it. Yes, sir.
Oh, yes. Isaac Woodard.
Uh-huh.
Have you heard of him?
Yes, that name sounds very familiar.
Isaac Woodard had received, first was working in a restricted area, a danger area, and he got medals for that. Then he became a soldier. He served in the Pacific. He obtained all kinds of medals. En route home, he landed in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And at that point in time, he boarded the Greyhound bus for North Carolina.
Okay.
And before he arrived in North Carolina, he had to relieve himself. The Greyhound bus driver was white and had a few words, but anyway, so he said, go ahead. So he went and relieved himself, but it said on the signs it says for whites only. They had no black restrooms.
Restrooms, yeah.
Right, there. So the Greyhound, we got back on the bus, and the Greyhound bus driver said, did you? He said, yeah. So he pulled into the next town, there was a policeman there. And he called the policeman and told the policeman that this guy had relieved himself in a white restroom. So they took him off the bus. And they beat him.
Yeah.
And them guys in out both eyes.
Both of his eyes, yeah.
And what happened after that? The guy who did it, he was exonerated. And there was an embarrassment for this country. At that point in time, Harry Truman pursue action against the guy who did it, who was exonerated,
Right.
incidentally.
Right.
And they couldn't get any result.
Yeah.
So that's when Truman decided to push for desegregation of the armed forces.
Yeah.
And in so doing, he lost the case. But what happened then, he decided to desegregate the armed forces. And that's exactly what brought it about. It was a split.
Yeah.
The Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, who was the head of the Dixiecrats, ran against the Democrats.
Right.
But he lost.
Right.
And Truman won, and Truman ran against Dewey.
And almost lost. That's right.
And Truman won. And that's when he got an order to desegregate the armed forces. And that's what brought about desegregation of armed forces. As I said, Strom Thurmond, who was a Dixiecrat, they split, and Truman still won. Given about how the who was it? Some paper in Chicago was kidding about how that Truman had lost because he ran against Dewey.
Right.
But it was wrong. He didn't win. He won. And that's what brought about desegregation of armed forces.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, I'm curious about the body of literature that may exist around black women who served during this time.
Right.
I would like to hear, perhaps not now, but I think certainly it would be interesting to know there were many black women who served and served with distinction. I'm very curious how they were treated and what their stories were.
Yeah.
I would also suggest, before you touch on that, if you can, that I think people in the room should know who this gentleman is and what his contribution to this country is. And I don't know whether or not you can introduce him to.
And actually, if you want to do it again, we did at the beginning of the.
Okay, well, this gentleman sitting next to me is actually a Buffalo soldier. He studied with the cavalry. His name is Mr. Davis. And he served for 4 to 5 years in the military. And he was also one of the creators of this very institution. I invited him to come today because 50 years ago, as a political activist, after finishing his military service, he served the community and got York to be where it is today. If we have a minute, I know it's been a long lecture, but he's actually a legend in the area. New Guy Brewer. I met him at a gala for the Tuskegee Airmen, which is one of the other groups being honored today. 60 years late, but they are being honored. And he's a wonderful historian, great memory. And he's been telling me about your college, so that's why I brought him here today.
And how old is he?
How old is he? 88 years old. Earlier is 82 years old. And I think it's because of the effort of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo soldiers that the military really took conscience as to what they were doing. But to one of the questions that was asked is what happened after the war? Nothing changed. When they came back from the boats to Europe, and it was still white only, and blacks over here, and none of the servicemen that came back, even those that were officers, ever got jobs for the areas in which they had been trained. None of the Tuskegee Airmen could fly as pilots. None of those that went there ever got a job, and many of them will tell you they were offered jobs as porters. This morning we heard the story of one of them being told he could work cleaning up the airplane but not flying it. And these guys were top pilots, for the war. So Mr. Davis, he's a wonderful guy. I'm glad he came here today.
To answer your question, Nate, there is a body of literature on black women in World War II, but it's tremendously small. I guess to think of a metaphor, if you thought about, the Atlantic Ocean is just a body of World War II literature. the literature, the writing, both books and articles about the black military experience essentially would just be like the shore. And then if you just took black women out of it, it'd be like a little tide pool. I mean, it's almost nothing. But what does exist is phenomenal. One of the best books I've read was Brenda Moore's To Serve My Country, to Serve My Race. And in it, yes, you find that black women endured the same things that Dokes was going through, the same things that the other soldiers were going through, where you had black WACs in Fort Des Moines, Iowa, who were trained to participate in distributing mail. In V-mail, I didn't put a copy of V-mail, but V-mail was essentially the early version of our microfilm, where soldiers would write a letter on a standard piece of paper, and then a picture of it would be taken, and then it would be just shrunk so that it would make it easier to transport the letters. And so many of these black women, just like other WACs, are trained in this. But when they get to the fort to do the work, they're told, okay, you clean up the fort. You know, you clean the bathrooms, you pick up. And so there's an example of mutiny. I can't remember the name of the fort, but it was in Kentucky, where a group of black women just said, that's enough. We're not doing this anymore. You either give us jobs where we're supposed to, or, you know, we're going to burn this thing down. So no, there is some literature on it. It's not very deep, and so there's a lot to explore. And the other aspect I guess I would address too is on the home front. One of the things that I find interesting, it won't quite fit into, I can't fit it neatly into this book that I'm writing because I'm really focusing on just the letters and the reports, but is Carol Cruz's Dokes' absolutely critical role in sustaining the church back home. And so let me see if I can back up to, there's a photograph of this is Reverend Oaks in Israel, and in '63, traveled quite a bit. It's him at the River Jordan, and then this is him getting an autograph from David Ben-Gurion, I believe. Yes. Yeah. But the photograph, yeah, here it is. This is a photograph of the members of many of the key members of Second Baptist after Reverend Dokes had left. The man in the middle, where the crease is in the picture, he's the supply minister that the National Congregation had sent to them to have. But, you know, Reverend Bobbitt, they say he's a nice guy, but he really didn't do anything. So it was Carol Cruz Dokes that was holding the church together, you know, and holding the community together. She even traveled to Chicago as part of the National Baptist Convention. She did a number of other things. And so there are a number of really incredible stories, I would imagine, on her side. Unfortunately, I don't have the writings to do it, but I see clippings, and there's stuff that's there, absolutely, that's there for either women who were, say, WACs, or women who served on the home front, who remained on the home front.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the concluding question, take my privilege as chair of the lecture committee. But as the issues were raised here in the last few questions, came out the very strong connection between history and memory. And memory is selective. What is continued and what is forgotten. And different cultures have different traditions for preserving their memories. Some are more written and some are within the oral tradition. Right. And you're doing oral history, which is very crucial. Can you comment on the status of this in the historical profession in the Western tradition, which tends to focus on the printed record?
Right. There still remains some controversy around the use of oral histories in our profession. Historians tend to work with documents and documents alone. I guess I have somewhat of a distrust of documents, or at least a sense of distance, that I don't necessarily believe everything's written down. So I think you have to treat documents just like you would treat any other witness, and then try to corroborate. But yeah, there is some resistance to that. To me, it's absolutely integral to this. And so interviewing the surviving members, we started actually, before I even started really looking at stuff, just sitting down and interviewing Carol Jean. I was doing a postdoc in Newark at the Rutgers Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience in 2001, when she was emptying out her basement and taking these documents down to the library, Alexander Library in New Brunswick. And so kind of a circuitous route, this information kind of got back to me. And so we just started talking. And I wanted just to start with this. Just what are your recollections of your father? You know, what do you remember? And then ultimately we got to the lunch with the surviving members, who again kind of corroborated for me my sense that this was a very engaged man, a very thoughtful man, but a very powerful advocate, because they were saying, yes, honey, he was something different. And one of the stories, they told me lots of stories, but I'll just share this one and we'll leave. When Reverend Dokes came home and came back to leading Second Baptist Church, he worked a full-time job as a teacher and never took a salary from the church. The members of the church themselves were migrants, most of whom had come from the South working in the fields in New Jersey. Some were worked as domestic. So these are people who didn't have a lot of money. So he refused to take a salary from the church. He just worked for himself, earned his money. So the members of the church talked about how much they loved Reverend Dokes, but whenever there was a big revival in North Jersey and all the black churches got together, they were a little embarrassed because he would drive his beat-up car. All right, he wasn't like the other ministers who had big Cadillacs and the big Buicks and all this stuff. So the church said, we have to give you this car. So they bought him, I think it was a Buick, or was it?
No, they bought him a
Continental, Lincoln Continental.
He had a Studebaker and a Henry J. and one of those low model GM cars or Ford or something like that. But on Sundays, he had to come out in this Lincoln Continental so that he would be like the rest of the ministers.
Right,
because he had, and another thing I want to talk about oral history. And one of the things that I feel is that we can learn facts to study for a test. But what we're hearing today and what oral history provides is the feelings. And I think feelings are very important because they stand behind, well, why did you do this? Well, I felt like this, or it was my perception or interpretation of something. So oral history is important because it gives the feelings behind the facts.
All right, thank you to everybody.